Okay, and we're streaming. Excellent. So, green anarchism towards the abolition of hierarchy. In the last few decades, new forms of activism have begun to emerge that concern not merely the fate of human society, but the non-human world, including non-human animals and the environment as well. In their most radical forms, these struggles culminated in what has been termed by some as eco or green anarchism. Green anarchism can be taken to consist in any political doctrine that takes some of the key components of anarchist thought, whatever these are deemed to be. This is so. This, like
Yeah, it's a little
the minutiae of this are just astounding.
yeah.
And applies them towards the critique of the interaction of humans with the non-human world. This definition is a good start, but is perhaps, like many definitions of anarchism, unsatisfactorily vague, I'd say so.
Mm.
This essay will propose a more specific definition of green anarchism, which will later be explained as a political doctrine that strives for the abolition of hierarchy in general. In order for this to make sense, oh, sorry, did I cut you off?
No,
Okay.
not really.
In order for this to make sense, it will be first necessary to say some important things about social anarchism, and in particular the emphasis upon opposing social hierarchy. And from here, the perspective will be applied to explain what is meant by green anarchism. I will then tie in some of the most exciting topics of green anarchist thinking, namely animal rights and social ecology. And for this reason, I hope that this essay will provide a solid introduction for those who are new to the topic. I will then conclude with an adventurous assertion. Green anarchism, as it is here understood, represents the most developed and most coherent expression of anarchist thinking. I hope that the reader will be enticed and outraged enough by this claim to accompany me on an understanding of why I think it is fair. Okay, social anarchism. The green anarchist perspective can be described as emerging from a more general anarchist outlook, which will be described as social anarchism. Social anarchism, the view that all social hierarchies should be abolished. What is meant by society will be taken to refer quite simply to the human world, whilst what is meant by hierarchy will be a system of domination that involves the subordination of the interests of one individual or group of individuals by another. Accordingly, we can see that social anarchism strives to eliminate hierarchy from the human world entirely. And in other words, sorry, that it desires for human relations to be ordered amongst genuine equals, meaning that no human being should have the right to treat another, formally or informally, as their property. Social anarchism, such as has much in common with more orthodox strains of radical thought, such as classical anarchism, which tends primarily towards opposition of the state, as well as Marxism, which maintains instead an economic focus on class and capitalism. While social anarchism shares these aims in common, where it diverges from these ideologies, it is in its refusal to recognize the state or capitalism as being at the foundation of all that is wrong with today's world. Rather, as according to a perspective that is broader and more radical, it regards the state and capitalism as being at the surface of a complex structure of domination that casts its roots much deeper, hierarchy. At this, with this point of view in mind, we can explain why, as anarchism developed throughout its history, it began to focus its effort upon opposing on all forms of human domination, which excludes but are not limiting to the state and capitalism. Here are some of other examples of social hierarchies: racism, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, ageism, ableism, etc. Social anarchism strives to abolish all of these, and places a particular emphasis upon the intersection between them. It is argued that one form of domination cannot be understood, let alone opposed, without recognizing the common roots that it shares with all the others. Reading these the anarchy articles out loud is because the run-on sentences, whew, I do
Yeah,
not have the lung capacity.
it's written to be like quote unquote legitimate theory
Yeah.
without actually being like so far all we've gone through in this social anarchism section is Murray Bookchin.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And not even like the books that he wrote, more like some of the lectures that he's given.
Uh-huh.
This rehashes that.
Ah.
Yeah. But hierarchical domination was sort of his contribution to the discourse.
Oh, okay.
His biggest contribution, I should say. Social ecology is another one, but they're going to get to that in just a moment, trust me.
God, where was I? Okay, social anarchism strives to abolish all of these and places a particular emphasis upon the intersection between them. Breathe. It is argued that one form of domination cannot be understood, let alone opposed, without recognizing the common roots it shares with all others, meaning that particular instances of domination cannot be separated from a broader hierarchical system that they all arise from. As such, we could say that social anarchism goes beyond recognizing the opposition of different forms of hierarchy as distinct struggles that are merely compatible, and recognizes that instead as different aspects of the very and recognizes them instead as different aspects of the very same struggle, namely the struggle for social anarchy.
You want me to read the next section so you can take a break?
Yes, please.
Sure. So, green anarchism. Having looked at relevant components of social anarchism, we will now be in a position to turn the focus of this essay, which is green anarchism. While social anarchism limits its scope to critiquing power structures that are confined to our own species, green anarchism applies precisely the same perspective towards also critiquing the way that humans interact with the non-human world. Green anarchism, the view that all hierarchies should be abolished. The definitions of green and social anarchism that have been provided are indeed very similar, but the crucial difference between is that the word social has been from the definition of green anarchism. As such, we can see that social anarchism is more specific because it focuses on dismantling all hierarchical human relations, whilst green anarchism is more general because it strives to remove all hierarchy in general, not merely from how we treat members of our own species, but from the way in which we treat non-humans as well. It should be clarified that this is not proposing that we interfere with hierarchies that exist outside of the sphere of human activity, assuming that non-human hierarchies even exist, which they do. We'll get to that later. Which is a contentious point that will not be covered here, which it should be. Rather, green anarchism proposes that all hierarchies that are a consequence of human activity, whether they are contained within our own society or not, must be dismantled. This view is often translated to the struggle for total liberation, which can be seen to strive not merely for the fulfillment of one or more particular liberation struggles, for example, for racial equality or for gender equality, but for united fulfillment of all liberation struggles in unison. According to this position, when we got to the bottom of what is worth opposing about any one form of hierarchy, we recognize that the very same structure is reproduced in all others. As such, it is argued that the most consistent struggle for liberation must be total, and not merely opposed to those forms of hierarchy that appeal to the most to our convenience, but strive instead for the liberation of all forms of life from hierarchical domination. Having said that, we can now add two more examples of hierarchy to the list that was mentioned in the last section. Speciesism and environmental domination. These will be explained separate in the following two sections. So, I think we're about to start getting into parts where this isn't, I wouldn't describe this article as a definitive summarization of green anarchism. I would describe it as an example of green anarchist tendency, of a specific green anarchist tendency. This one being like the vegan or deep ecological form of green anarchism. Green anarchism should be more broadly an anarchism which is developed with specific insight into ecological concerns. This is presenting green anarchism as striving for animal rights and animal liberation and environmental liberation. Specifically as like equal aspects of the anarchist like platform, and what that means in its entirety when you get to the logical conclusion of the rhetoric we're about to go through. You end up with anti-civ or primitivist conclusions. So we will continue then into their discussion of animal rights. Let me take a sip of my tea because there's a lot. The idea of animal rights proposes that the kind of moral consideration that is often granted to members of our own species should be extended to non-human animals as well. This thinking goes hand in hand with green anarchism, because it can be seen to argue upon recognizing that hierarchies that pervade our own society should be abolished, that the hierarchies that involve human subordination of other species of animals should be abolished for much the same reasons. Central to this approach is the notion of speciesism, which refers to a prejudice in favor of the interests of members of one's own species against the interests of members of the other species. This type of hierarchy is not based upon the recognition of any actual capacities held by members of other species, but instead on the mere fact that they are not members of our own group. I have to point out a contention I take with that point. I think that, we mentioned it off air, but when we talk about the way animal husbandry specifically and agriculture more broadly were developed, these are not necessarily hierarchies established by the mere fact that they are not members of our own group. These are, more often than not, closer to symbiotic relationships. The shepherd does offer a service to the sheep.
Okay.
And in indigenous animal husbandry, typically it is the human and the domesticated animals or semi-domesticated animals, the herd animals, working with each other much more. I don't think you would describe, for example, the Native Americans hunting buffaloes as a hierarchical domination of the buffalo by the human. To do sort of has to take a different definition of authority in general than what is common in anarchist theory. In that we're not looking at necessary established social dominations, we're looking at practices of coexistence, which leave the expertise of, for example, handling predators to the expert in handling predators, that being the human who develops the fences and the tools for addressing predation. And then the animals with the liberty to, for example, free graze or roam the land freely, up to the limit at which the human has to set to deal with predation, the boundaries of that grazing. So you wouldn't, for example, if you were a shepherd, you wouldn't leave your herd in a pen for its entire life. You would let your herd graze up into the limit of where you can guarantee its safety. So you wouldn't let your sheep climb down the cliff because you'd never be able to get the sheep back up the cliff, and so the sheep would then die. This type of hierarchy is not the mere fact that they are not members of our own group, but it is more a symbiotic relationship. It's a husbandry. However, that's neither here nor there. I have to point this out because the article takes a very hardline stance against. It's a vegan article essentially. It takes a very hardline stance against something that probably shouldn't have a hard line against it. Continuing on.
Okay.
Importantly, the logical structure of speciesism is argued to be the same as all other forms of social hierarchy. For example, it is integral to the attempted justification of racism, which locates what someone's race happens to be as a basis for dominating them, just as well to sexism, which depends instead on one's sex. As such, proponents of animal rights argue that speciesist logic is just as irrational as that of any other form of domination. Just because someone else is different to me does not mean that they do not count morally, or that they can be dominated as if they were a resource for my own ends. Again, this is conflating all. This sort of doesn't make any attempt not to conflate all animal husbandry with factory farming. If we remove the veil of speciesism and recognize the capacities that non-human animals often generally do possess, then what are we left with? Despite the sometimes vast differences between humans and non-humans, one property that we seem to hold in common is what is argued to be crucial for moral consideration: sentience. Sentience is understood as the capacity to be conscious of the world, or in other words, to have experience of one's own point of view, which, perhaps most importantly for animal rights, translates to the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. It follows that when a sentient non-human animal, such as a pig, donkey, or fish, is dominated by a hierarchical structure, that they suffer harm in much the same way that the human being does. As such, it is argued what species one happens to be a member of is ultimately irrelevant, and that is whether or not one is sentient, be they human or not, that is crucial for moral consideration, meaning that anarchist struggles should be broadened to include animal liberation as well.
I mean, generally, I'm totally on board that, the harm against animals should be a moral consideration. And just the first thing I thought, if conscience is the benchmark, then, if, a dog and a person in a coma are, in a house on fire, do you take the dog and leave the person?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the other consideration here is that this consideration, sentience, this definition of sentience that they give, is as ambiguous as drawing the line between human and non-human.
Yeah.
So sentience isn't like a innate trait of the animal, right? So, for example, a fly is aware of the world around it. Whether it has the capacity to feel pain or pleasure, that is not an aspect of sentience. That's an aspect of neurological development. For example, trees can feel pain, and we know that they feel pain because when a tree is hit with an axe and that axe wound is left to heal over time, the tree releases a certain amount of spores, which then notify the other trees in the forest of a potential threat. Moss is genuinely aware of where to find its resources, and you would assume gains some pleasure from acquiring those resources. That's sort of how organisms operate. There's a positive feedback response for everything that every living thing does. This definition of sentience that's used in the article, there's no distinction between a human being and a mushroom. As such, then, the actual most clear definition that we can have does revert back to being species. Because we can't properly define which beings are or are not sentient. How sentient is a Venus flytrap? This sort of, you have to get into a more metaphysical definition of what sentience is in order to maintain this perspective. And that's, we read another article that we'll get to later that was very heavy into scientific environmentalism. And this is what that is designed to combat. Because there isn't really a scientific line at sentience that's been established. And then, of course, when we talk about moral consideration, that doesn't necessarily mean not even total liberation, but total separation or segregation of human processes and environmental processes. I told you the article is very reliant on Murray Bookchin for social ecology, which is the next section we'll get into. But one thing that it conveniently leaves out of the Bookchinite sort of definitions of ecology are that human evolution happens within nature. Our technologies are natural developments because we are natural creatures. What's not natural is the capitalistic property relations and the state or nation state social relations that then have an impact on that evolution. So
also,
such,
moral consideration doesn't mean you value two things. Moral consideration does not mean that you value two things at the same time. you can consider two things morally and then decide, you don't care about one of two. So actually, it's not, yeah.
So here's a moral consideration. If a lion eats a gazelle, right?
Mm-hmm.
In our moral consideration, which of those is good and which is bad?
Mm-hmm.
Is the lion bad for eating the gazelle? No, it's not. That's a natural process. Similarly, humans are omnivorous.
Mm-hmm.
If you're granting quote unquote moral consideration to animals and treating them as humans, then a human living up to its omnivorous nature
mm-hmm.
is then immoral. Is a bear immoral?
Mm-hmm.
No, because a bear is not a human.
Mm-hmm.
And they said they only refer to human activities in their, right?
Yeah.
So like their practice only applies to human activities. So it's an incomplete moral consideration in and of itself. So there are a lot of problems with the way that this is developed.
Mm-hmm.
And as we sort of pick at the rhetoric, we start to see some of the holes that open up that create conflict later.
Mm-hmm.
But first, let's get back into the discussion. We'll go back to social ecology. Let me take another sip. Murray Bookchin first proposed the notion of social ecology, which can be related quite simply as arguing the idea that we as humans must dominate the natural world stems from the idea that we as humans must dominate each other. As such, social ecology asserts that social issues and ecological issues are inseparable, because social hierarchy is ultimately responsible for our hierarchical attitude towards the non-human world. That's backwards. Murray Bookchin first proposed the notion of social ecology, which should be relayed, quite simply as arguing the idea that we as humans must dominate each other, stemming from the idea that we as humans must dominate the environment. Murray Bookchin's argument was essentially that as we developed agriculture, and then from agriculture developed the separation of labor, right, division of labor, then we developed hierarchical domination as a way to organize the division of labor. It seems like a purely academic distinction, but it's really not. Because what this rhetoric sort of implies is that there is a human base instinct to dominate one another. And that this idea arises naturally in humans and then is applied later to things like agriculture. In fact, in actuality, agriculture is the most effective way to provide for our needs. If, for example, humans didn't dominate the natural world in places like the Pueblos, which is like the southwestern United States, where it's deserts and indigenous people live through agriculture, growing a sort of corn, essentially, maize. If we did not develop that domination of the natural world, then those people would not have survived. So at a certain point, the consideration that they make in this section is a little bit more damaging than the one they do in the animal rights section, which is, at this point, is starting to turn into an argument against agriculture. Anyway, continuing on, this manifests itself as an understanding of the natural world as human property, which reduces it to a mere pool of resources that is evaluated exclusively according to its instrumental use for human desires. However, even if this attitude might be said to serve our short-term interests, its long-term consequences have culminated in ecological crisis, involving issues such as global warming, resource scarcity, pollution, mass extinction, deforestation, and soil degradation, that has come to threaten the very possibility of our species to continue to survive. This part is true, except it's not the idea that humans must dominate one another that manifests itself into understanding the natural world as human property. No, it's actually just exploitative property relations that require resources be evaluated according to use value, as opposed to, for example, labor value. So milk is only valuable insofar as it's useful for people to drink or make cheese out of, I suppose. If we were using a system of labor value as opposed to use value, then the labor that the cow conducts to provide the milk would have to be considered. So this problem is not necessarily solved only through anarchism. This problem is actually solved through any base Marxist, like, labor theory of value perspective. But that's, maybe that sounds like pedantry, but when we get towards the conclusion, you'll understand why that comes back up. Beyond merely analyzing these issues, social ecology finds a truly revolutionary translation. If our ecological problems find their roots... we're next to the picture. If our ecological problems find their roots in social problems, then the solutions to these ecological problems too must find their roots in radical social change. The ambition to this social change would be to dismantle the hierarchical structures that pervade our own societies and replace them with genuinely egalitarian ones. These would find their form in decentralized, community-based, directly democratic means of organization, the atoms of a green anarchist society, of any anarchist society, that would cater for the widest range of human need, locate through an ecological concern as its basic tenet. That probably shouldn't be your basic tenet. It would only be then, once we have found the balance within our own society, that we might be able to find a sustainable balance within the natural world as well. Sure. However, social ecology should not be mistaken for anti-technology or anti-civilization critique that strives to find balance within nature by returning some kind of pre-industrial tribal society. Primitivism can be described as seeking social transformation along these lines and can certainly come infused with interesting anarchist currents, but is not the focus of social ecology, nor is it the focus of this essay. I disagree. On the contrary, social ecology seeks to synthesize what might be regarded as some of the most desirable aspects of more primitive societies, such as their decentralized and ecological means of existing, with some of the most desirable aspects of modern society, such as its alleged focus on reason, science, and technology. So here we have a very key contradiction in this formation of green anarchism, which is that they have essentially written a manifesto against the concept of animal husbandry and greater, in a lot of ways, against the concept of agriculture at large. And then said it might be regarded as some of the most desirable aspects of more primitive societies, which were only able to develop those desirable aspects because of animal husbandry and agriculture. The decentralized and ecological means of existing are only possible because of indigenous forms of agriculture. Because it wasn't always factory farming that was driving agriculture. And the mad desire to centralize resources and to commodify them, which is to take a resource and define it only by its use value, which you then translate to an exchange value. So those processes are necessary for a lot of the technologies that we've developed. If you look at materialism broadly, isn't just a Marxist materialism. If you look at any socialist theory that has materialism as a base, then you understand that a lot of the processes and a lot of the systems of hierarchy that we developed as we evolved to the point that we have as a society, whether they were toxic or not, are necessary. Our society would never have existed, for example, without coal mining.
Of course.
Coal mining is incredibly harmful. But without coal mining, we wouldn't have gotten the railway. Without the railway, and we can go back and back and back. Without deforesting, we wouldn't have invented, the types of transportation ships that made transatlantic travel possible. Without the United States of America would not exist.
Yeah. If you look at ecological means of existing as meaning, for example, like you consider sustainability as an argument for whether, like, how you judge a system, then you could defend, for example, the Inuit and their way of life, who are like use a lot of animal products, but they, have existed like that for thousands of years, and it's very sustainable, and a lot of, indigenous farming practices are very sustainable, but factory farming is very not, and should, under these ecological means
Right.
of existence, should be disregarded,
Right.
or should be, sorry, should be stopped. So
Yeah, precisely.
yeah.
I think what we're digging at here is they have described as hierarchical domination sort of the human's natural, at this point, their natural role within this ecological superstructure, which is developing agricultural practice and husbandry practices that are actually healthy or sustainable within the environment. When what they should have been doing was taking the Marxist critique of commodification and alienation and applying those to environmental concerns. I'm not a Marxist. I am an anarchist. But there were other articles that we've looked at and that we'll get to in the future that sort of take a more muted critique than this. This is one of the more hardline stances, which does have primitivist sort of implications.
Yeah.
That they then just sort of say, we're not anti-technology, we're just anti the type of organization that provides technology. So I guess we get to their conclusion.
Yeah, but
on
that,
the abolition of,
sorry, but it was also hierarchical organization that brought us technology and brought us universities and governments and exploration of the world. So wouldn't any anarchist be sort of said to be against the sort of society that brought us the technology that we now value?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. See, because when I read a lot of foundational anarchist theory, and we're talking about things back to the mid 1800s, their understanding of what is authority or what is hierarchy is very different from our understanding.
Okay.
And their understanding of horizontal organization is very different than our understanding.
Okay.
We would describe almost all anarchist thought from its foundation as anarcho-syndicalist. Because there was still sort of an understanding of these sort of structures, like the university would still function as a university. But whereas in the 1800s, a university is owned by the state, their suggestion is that the state should not own the university, but rather it should be a collective effort.
Okay.
Whereas all the professors would own the university. In that way, it's very similar to Marxism.
Okay.
Which is why you have unions like the International that Marx and Bakunin were both part of that existed. Because they are working broadly toward the same goal through different means. So I think, I don't know, I think anarchism in general is not necessarily against the abolition of things like markets even. That would be probably described as a mutualist anarchist system.
That was the thing about the Eco-Anarchist Manifesto that you linked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was...
That guy, I'm gonna have some yelling to do next time.
Yeah, that guy, very rude. I would liken his rhetoric to like how Lenin wrote. If you consider Lenin as representing communism, he uses very inflamed communistic rhetoric to say some anti-communist things. In a similar fashion, the guy who wrote the Eco-Anarchist Manifesto uses some very anarchist rhetoric to say some very hierarchical things.
Yeah.
But however, when we get to the point about the markets,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna have to temper you a little bit because I don't think that his aim is to develop markets. I think his aim is to manipulate markets for an immediate end.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that my aim isn't to take control of a government,
Okay.
my aim is to manipulate a government to give us health care and welfare.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the difference in the program of his manifesto. It's more an outline of the direction of his immediate praxis than it is a description of his utopian goal.
He advocates for privatizing the commons. Like in case of Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons is concerning an ordinarily individual good, the problem may be solved by privatizing the common good and using the market as for allocation. Like, no,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, he is.
So like,
He is.
Donald Trump gets a nice view on the lake, and I'm like, well, sucks to suck.
I don't think that's what he's intending. I think he's intending to establish a union
Mm-hmm.
that functions within the market that then has economic sway to enact its own privatization. So, like, if you imagine if the IWW
Yeah.
had,
Does he mention unions? Does he mention unions? Did I completely miss that part?
No, but this is because I know the anarchist tendency that
Mm-hmm.
he's writing from.
Oh, okay.
So I know how it operates.
Mm-hmm.
When he's discussing using privatization, what he means is the anarchists would buy the resources and then redistribute them ourselves. So imagine if we decided to buy Monsanto and then give the seeds away. Right? It's not the most efficient way to do it, but there is a coherent potentiality for a praxis that could be developed.
Okay.
It's not what I would advocate for. I'm more in favor of like finding the people who own this stuff and cutting their heads off, theoretically, in a video game. But like, yeah, I'm more in favor of crude redistribution. But his question is more that if we have two options, we find a way to manipulate the markets or we find a way to manipulate the state. He's in favor of finding a way to manipulate the market. But when you write that in a manifesto like the one he wrote, you cannot make that sound anything other than like
libertarian.
Nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't write that more without making like a 600-page Das Kapital like book. You can't,
because also with like the anti-natalism and the if we raise the price of oil, then there's going to be fewer agricultural machines, and so more people are going to get work digging potatoes. It's like, oh great, we're going to reintroduce serfdom. That sounds wonderful. Thank you. Can't wait.
And, like, I picked his manifesto out like very deliberately because
to annoy me, and I really hold it against you.
It was malicious. No, it was because all the time that we were going over sort of like the eco-fascist stuff that we were doing for the last week or so. This whole time I was trying to explain to people that while organic farming can be good, you can use the rhetoric of organic farming to advocate for some terrible stuff.
Okay.
And the line between green anarchism and eco-fascism is actually blurrier than people like to admit.
Okay.
This is an example of that.
Yeah.
When you get into like anti-civ or what do they call it? Descaling or degrowth, maybe. When you get into anti-civ or degrowth sort of ideologies, which grow out of green anarchism fairly naturally, you then lead very quickly into eco-fascism.
Yeah.
It's a trend that this guy demonstrates very plainly, and that like Noam Chomsky gets a lot of stick for. He at one point acknowledged eco-fascist conclusions of his perspective on environmental collapse.
Okay.
He did that in like an interview. He like quite plainly said, as the environment collapses, eco-fascism will rise,
Mm-hmm.
and they probably won't be wrong.
Okay.
And so, like, they're very close trends. So if you aren't careful about the rhetoric that you use or the people that you read, you
Mm-hmm.
get into eco-fascism from green anarchism.
Yeah.
Another example of that is John Zerzan and Ted Kaczynski.
Oh, yeah.
They both take a green anarchist rhetoric
Mm-hmm.
and then lead you to eco-fascist conclusions
Mm-hmm.
through that rhetoric. Let me finish this article, though,
Oh,
really
sure,
quickly.
sure. Oh, just one point. Ted Kaczynski. I've got his book here. He really does not like primitivists. He like has as a whole essay like talking about how they're wrong on literally every point, and it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yep.
Yeah, it's Ted Kaczynski is someone that I don't want to say I don't recommend reading. I recommend reading very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
very
yes,
critically,
absolutely.
Because he writes well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He does do that thing where like he takes something that sounds dangerous, he breaks it down point by point, line by line, and deconstructs things in very, very persuasive ways.
Mm-hmm. He's a very good writer. Yes, absolutely.
At this point, we'll be in a position to venture a hypothesis, namely that green anarchism, rather than being some misanthropic parody designed for radicals with dreadlocks, that's a little bit insulting to people who have dreadlocks, represents instead an expression of anarchism in its most highly developed and most coherent form. That's not true, written it. It is not merely humans that are victims of state, capitalist, and more generally hierarchical destruction. The common victims of this complex of domination are ultimately all forms of life on Earth. That's very true.
Yeah.
Peter Kropotkin once said, "Equality in all is the synonym of equity. This is anarchism in very deed." It seems that Kropotkin, perhaps the single most celebrated hero of anarchism, we kind of kill those, recognized the essence of anarchism, equality in all things. What he perhaps did not recognize, as might instead be a deed reserved for the anarchists of today's world, is what it means to follow this essence to its logical conclusion. It's not a logical conclusion if your premises are illogical. If we are going to take the idea of equality seriously, should we not ask whether, rather than being confined to the boundary of our own species, our struggle should emphatically transcend it? It probably should.
Yes.
You've gone too far. In order to overcome one form of domination, we must ultimately overcome them all. We must overcome hierarchy in general. Moreover, in order to do this, we need to do more than merely understanding hierarchy. We must dedicate ourselves to building a broad and coherent movement, an ecology of resistance, that is capable of opposing it on all fronts. This may well be the most interesting time that we could ever have hoped to be alive. We will create the most exciting, the most revolutionary epoch that there has ever been, or we will remain confined by our prejudices until all hope of survival has rotted into dust. That whole last paragraph is pretty much unnecessary.
But it is a good rallying cry.
Yeah, so I always nitpick these articles when we read them. I like this.
Yeah.
I do like this article. There are some very like wide gaping holes in sort of the description of what's been done. And the foundation has been done with like a partial and at some points misinterpreted reading of like Murray book only. But that's not uncommon in all theory, really. Usually you mimic what you've been reading or writing lately and reproduce that in more and more context to try and get a more coherent idea out. I think some of the really good points here is that like ecological domination, environmental domination is a real thing, and it's something that we also have to consider in our critique. Sustainability should be as much a goal as liberation, because the two should go hand in hand. That's all true. I don't think that necessarily applies to calling animal husbandry a form of racism. I think that's a little bit insensitive to like genuine bigotries. I think we can have a conversation about the moral implications of like factory farming
Mm-hmm.
in like slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
I think those are pretty easily argued against on moral grounds. I don't know that you can argue for sustainable ecology on purely moralistic considerations.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, you have to go through that structural consideration first, which is like factory farms imply commodification of food.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to abolish capitalism, we have to abolish commodity. So we have to abolish factory farms.
Yeah.
And if we're going to save the environment, we
Mm-hmm.
have to favor sustainability. So we have to abolish factory farms.
Mm-hmm.
And then moralistically, like that question can, honestly, it can be put off. One thing that I've always strived to do in like my study of theory
Mm-hmm.
is to find ways to apply these things without moralistic consideration.
Okay.
Purely practical, purely pragmatic,
Mm-hmm.
purely mechanical and structural analysis. What's the best way to organize society for moving into the future
Mm-hmm.
is a much more compelling question to me than what is right or wrong, because you start to get into too many weeds,
Okay.
like defining sentience,
Mm-hmm.
or like defining the limits at which agriculture interferes with social ecology. All that stuff is very vague and very hard to like pin down.
Okay.
Um, but this is like, I also acknowledge that in a modern world, like if you were to talk to vegans
Mm-hmm.
who are not anarchists and try and get them to an anarchist conclusion, this is how you would do that.
Yeah.
Um,
Though, honestly, I find it surprising the amount of vegans who don't care about animal rights,
yeah,
which is really weird. Yeah.
it's and that's why online I always refer to like plant-based diets rather than vegan
Mm-hmm.
diets,
Yeah.
because veganism is supposed to be like a moral ideology,
Yeah.
not just like a diet plan.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you would go so far as to call it like vegan lifestyleism.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, there are a lot of vegans who like are not like ideologically vegan.
Mm-hmm.
They just eat plant-based products to say that that's what they do.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but like,
Sure. And also sometimes like an eating disorder, but you don't want to say you have an eating disorder, so you're like a raw vegan who doesn't eat 15 different kind of vegetables
yeah,
because yeah.
Brexit, I'm just vegan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's why your lunch is 3 sticks of celery. I see. Yeah, I don't know. The paragraph that gave me the most trouble
Mm-hmm.
is sort of at the bottom of their social ecology section, right before their end, where it says social ecology should not be mistaken for anti-technology or anti-civilization critique.
Mm-hmm.
They're right in that Bookchin's critique of social ecology is very all-encompassing and sort of takes into consideration that the human's role in the environment and modifying our environments and creating things like agriculture and animal husbandry is a natural process.
Yeah.
So when you study social ecology, at the back of that is always the idea that our systems of resource distribution or of growing food should exist within our own natural means to develop as society.
Yeah.
And that rather it's domination in those spheres that should be avoided. I think this critique just too far away from that. Synthesize what might be regarded as some of the most desirable aspects of more primitive societies, such as their decentralized and ecological means of existing, with some of the most desirable aspects of modern society, such as its alleged focus on reason, science, and technology. I don't like that sentence.
I also
Just
can't imagine
mm,
what that would look like.
yeah, that's why I don't like it,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not about sustainability. It doesn't describe like resource management.
Mm-hmm.
It's just decentralized and ecological means of existing, which to me is tribal primitivism. That's like literally what that sentence means.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And also, so many technologies are by necessity sort of centralized.
yes,
For an internet, you need, servers which have to stand somewhere. So, and somebody has control of that server.
correct. Um, yes, and like so for education,
Mm-hmm.
at some point, the university has to be centralized.
Mm-hmm.
For collaborative effort, the community has to be around education. Like you have to build a community around education, and
Mm-hmm.
we would call that a university.
Yeah.
And that is necessarily centralized.
Mm-hmm.
And then the findings that are developed within that environment are then shared
Yeah.
throughout the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you rely, or how do you focus on reason without the university, unless you're using a highly centralized internet to do worldwide communication? How do you? I think I think that's one of the questions that the next article was meant to answer.
Mm-hmm.
Is how do you get to decentralization?
Okay.
Um, and like it just goes really sideways really quickly. The last article that I
Okay.
wrote is similar. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we have now stripped back. We have returned away from
Yeah.
sort of moralistic discussion,
Mm-hmm.
and we've sort of eliminated the weird like economic manipulation like strategy
Mm-hmm.
that ANCAP sounding just nothingness. Um, and we have then asked just the straight questions, um, which is like how to make an anarchist policy
Mm-hmm.
or an anarchist response to the politics of climate change. Um, and it's like it explains how capitalistic and national competition are contributing
Yeah.
to ecological collapse
Mm-hmm.
without actually answering why or like what they plan to do.
Yeah.
That's why I like that article,
Mm-hmm.
because it asks the right questions. It just
Yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
answer them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I don't think that we have strong answers to them.
No.
The one we read, very good article
Mm-hmm.
for making a vegan or an anarchist.
Yeah.
I don't know that it is as good an article for making an anarchist a vegan.
Probably not. Because there are just too many excuses that, like, I completely agree. And personally, I think, like, living as I do, like, as divorced from nature and from animal husbandry as I am, like, I think for me, the moral thing to do, just environmentally, morally, from, like, trying to do the least amount of harm possible, I think veganism should be the choice I make. But also, I am completely comfortable with saying, using animal products in medicines. Yeah, sure. I'm completely comfortable with that. So like even even if I completely agree that yes, I should be a vegan, there's exceptions. I'm very happy to make.
Yeah, I think that sort of an understanding of cohabitation is very necessary.
Yeah.
Um, like we share the planet with animals. Animals should share
Yeah.
the planet with us. We should rely on one another.
Yes.
Animals should have access to human products. Humans should have access to animal products. And it should be done in a sustainable, natural way. But like another example is like the house cat.
Yeah.
If we were to eliminate hierarchical domination of animals, the house cat would go extinct.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
And
that's
first
what
it
the
would
creature.
at first it would run around outside and like kill all the birds. So first it would kill all
Yeah.
our songbirds and then die out.
Yeah, or like right now, if we don't keep bees in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of environments,
Yeah.
bees are no longer going to be sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
self-sufficient.
Yeah.
Right? Like as the temperature continues to raise 1 or 2 more degrees, coral reef is gone
Mm-hmm.
unless humans deliberately maintain coral reef.
Yeah.
So like the Great Barrier Reef is already going to die,
Mm-hmm.
and there's like nothing we can do to stop that.
Yeah.
The best we could do environmentally to maintain that sort of biodiversity
Mm-hmm.
would be to put coral reef into deliberate contained aquarium
Mm-hmm.
where we can control the conditions within that closed cell
Yeah.
microcosm. That is a domination.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of wildlife preserves.
Yeah.
We would have to let all of the lions out of the cages
Mm-hmm.
to eat all of the gazelle.
Yeah.
And we would, in all likelihood, lose biodiversity through that process.
Mm-hmm.
We would have to stop hunting deer,
Yeah.
which would disrupt rates of predation
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of temperate environments. And we would end up with woods filled with wolves.
Yeah.
Quite quickly. That's one of the more common, like, easily demonstrated side effects
Mm-hmm.
of nature preserves, wildlife preserves. It's one of the reasons that hunters are given licenses to hunt.
Mm-hmm.
Is that to maintain the balance of the ecosystem, things like hunting and animal husbandry have to exist.
Mm-hmm.
When we start getting into other examples, right? Like buffalo in the United States, we hunted buffalo to near extinction very, very quickly because buffalo products were a commodity.
Yeah.
I think commodification is a type of economic domination that is very easy to make an anarchist case against. But like hunting is not.
Yeah. I mean, that's the difference between hunting for food. Like the bison buffalo herds would still exist. Like the big thousands and thousands of buffalo herds. If people just hunted for food, which is the thing that actually makes sense to, you have a resource of food running around. You need to like do no work. You have zero effort. And you can just like occasionally shoot one buffalo. But no, we shot so many buffaloes that they died out, and that we literally took that resource away from us.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a lot of critiques in here, or a lot of calls for sustainability and balance with the natural world.
Yeah.
I agree with those without reaching sort of the radical vegan and primitivist conclusions that are sort of implied in some of the holes here.
Yeah.
Particularly with the notion of speciesism. I have never been get on board with a critique of species that refers to a prejudice. I can't find. I know that there are prejudices that people have.
Yeah.
And I know that you could call them species. But like, give me 1 second.
Sure. Oh, speaking of which, I have to go.
Oh, lovely. Good, because I was just about done anyway.
Oh, okay, great. So we didn't get as much as we were planning to, but we'll just get to that next time. And it was really lovely talking to you, and have a good evening.
Good night.